Algiers, 1830. The French army is advancing, the Ottoman government is falling. And only one man holds the power to change the fate of the city: banker Yacob Elbaz.
Shadow War Chief.
Algiers, 1830. The air was thick with salt and smoke as cannon fire echoed from the harbor, the French fleet casting long shadows across the Mediterranean. In the upper quarter of the Kasbah, behind latticed windows and arched cedar doors, Yacob Elbaz stood in his office, unmoved, watching the sea boil under the foreign assault. He was a man shaped by numbers, not nations. In ledgers bound in calfskin, he held the weight of debts owed by pashas, consuls, and corsair captains alike. For 3 decades, the name Elbaz had flowed quietly through Algiers like an underground river, feeding the Ottoman administrators, outfitting merchant ships, even financing French agents when the occasion demanded it. But now the tide had turned. Outside, the Dey's palace trembled under bombardment. The Ottoman soldiers were losing ground, and with them went centuries of fragile balance. The French had come not to trade, but to take. And Yacob knew what they truly sought. Not the Dey's crumbling forts. Not even the symbolic insult of the fly-whisk that had supposedly sparked the invasion. No. The French were after the silver veins of influence buried deep beneath the city. The debt ledgers, the trade routes, the gold reserves carefully concealed in hidden accounts. They were after him. His clients called him discreet. His enemies called him dangerous. But few knew how thin the line was between the two. In the lower drawer of his desk, beneath the velvet pouch of Ottoman dinars and the false bottom lined with cedar shavings, was a sealed envelope with no name. Only a symbol burned into the wax. A lion devouring a scorpion. It was not Ottoman. It was older. The French wouldn't know what to make of it, not at first. But they would understand its value soon enough. And when they did, Yacob would no longer be a banker. He would be a target. A knock sounded on the outer door. Not a servant's tap, firm, purposeful. Yacob folded the ledger shut and slid it into the wall recess behind a tapestry. He opened the drawer, hesitated for only a breath, and took the envelope. It disappeared into the folds of his robe just as the door opened and Ismail stepped in. Tall, lean, and dressed like a merchant's guard, Ismail had the bearing of someone who'd long since stopped pretending to be what he wasn't. "They landed at Sidi Frej," Ismail said. "They're moving inland. You have less time than we thought." Yacob nodded, fingers steepled beneath his beard. "What of the palace?" "Still holding, but the Dey is negotiating. They say he might surrender." Of course he would. The Dey was not a man of war. He was a man of spectacle. His rule, like his silks, was fraying. "Then we leave," Yacob said. "Tonight?" Ismail's voice dropped. "You have enough gold for that?" "I have enough to buy time. And in war, time is the only true currency." But escape was not the plan. Not yet. Before leaving, Yacob had one final transaction to complete. One that had waited 17 years. One that involved a betrayal, a hidden vault, and the man who had once been his closest friend. He turned to the shelves behind him, selecting a scroll case made of dark olive wood. Inside was not a scroll but a map, drawn decades earlier, during the days when the Barbary corsairs ruled these waters and Spanish gold moved in secret through North Africa. The vault still existed. He had kept it hidden, untouched, waiting for the moment when all else collapsed. Now the moment had come. Far below, in the alleys of the Kasbah, fires had already begun to spread. And across the city, whispers had taken flight, that the French would offer amnesty to anyone who helped secure Ottoman assets. Loyalty was cheap, gold was cheaper. But knowledge, that was priceless. And Yacob Elbaz, banker of Algiers, knew everything. The streets of Algiers, once vibrant with the pulse of trade and prayer, had turned into a maze of uncertainty. Ottoman banners still hung from some windows, but others had already been stripped clean. Children whispered that the French would pay for information, and neighbors watched each other with newly sharpened eyes. Yacob moved through the alleys not like a fugitive but like a shadow, cloaked in neutral garments and accompanied only by Ismail, whose silent presence discouraged inquiry. They took routes known only to spice merchants and old smugglers, paths layered in secrecy. They reached the Hammam al-Kebir, the city's oldest bathhouse, long abandoned and overtaken by vines and sand. Inside, Yacob led Ismail to the far wall where tiles had been chipped away centuries ago, exposing an arch of sandstone bricks. He pressed 3 stones in sequence. The wall groaned and shifted. Beneath the bathhouse lay a vault built during the days of the Hafsid dynasty, long before Ottoman rule. The room was dry, cool, and deeper than memory. No gold lay in its corners, only crates sealed in wax and linen, marked with merchant sigils and ancient numbers. Ismail lit a lantern, eyes scanning the contents. "What is all this?" Yacob answered without looking up. "History, debt, leverage." Inside the crates were not treasures of gold or jewels but something far more dangerous: contracts, receipts, letters, treaties, evidence of secret loans and bribes stretching across 3 empires. Names of French officers who had accepted Ottoman payments. European banks that had profited from slavery and piracy. Religious leaders who had quietly backed Muslim corsairs in exchange for spice trade advantages. If the French wanted legitimacy for their invasion, these documents could destroy it. Yacob unrolled a parchment, eyes resting on the signature at its bottom. Claude Derville. A name buried deep in the past, but now crawling back into relevance. Claude had been a diplomat, once Yacob's closest associate in Marseille. They had built fortunes together, navigating the gray waters between legality and empire. Then Claude had betrayed him, had sold secrets to the French crown, had nearly ended Yacob's life with a single whisper in a foreign court. Now, Yacob had in his possession a letter signed in Claude's own hand, a record of collusion with Ottoman corsairs during a time when France publicly condemned such dealings. It was the kind of evidence that could unseat a minister, perhaps even trigger scandal back in Paris. And Yacob knew precisely how to use it. He sealed the document in oilskin, placed it in a small chest, and handed it to Ismail. "You'll take this to Marseille," Yacob said. "Deliver it to the contact in the Rue des Chanoines. Use the name, Solon. Say the lion has remembered." Ismail nodded, but hesitated. "And you?" "I stay. But if the French? They already know my name. They've known it for years. What they don't know is where the real power lies." Because it was not the ledgers or the vault that made Yacob dangerous. It was memory, long, meticulous memory, of who owed what and why. By the time Ismail disappeared into the early morning haze, the city had changed again. The Dey's palace flew a white flag. Algiers had fallen. French soldiers marched in with bandoliers and bayonets, but their true conquests were made quietly, behind doors, in rooms scented with ink and fear. And when they came for Yacob Elbaz, dressed now in a scholar's robe, sipping thick coffee in his courtyard, they did not bring chains. They brought a ledger. "Your reputation precedes you," said the officer, placing it before him. "General Bermont requests your cooperation in assessing the Ottoman debts and assets. In return, full protection for you and your estate." Yacob smiled. A transaction, at last. He took the ledger, opened it, and made a single correction. "I'll need better ink," he said. And the French officer, thinking himself victorious, obliged. To the French, he was now an asset, valuable, perhaps even indispensable. General Bermont's officers had turned one of Yacob's salons into an impromptu office, their boots scuffing mosaic floors that had once hosted Ottoman pashas and corsair captains. They came with ledgers in French, translated decrees, and wide assumptions about how the city worked. But Algiers was not Paris. It never had been. Yacob listened as they read numbers aloud, trying to match the empire's wealth to columns and sums. They were looking for silver, for land, for cargo manifests that could be taxed and monetized. They missed the most important detail: most of the wealth had already moved. Weeks before the bombardment, before even the rumors of invasion had taken serious shape, Yacob had quietly unwound the threads of the Ottoman accounts, redirecting cargo to neutral ports, converting dinars into Spanish reals and Dutch guilders, hiding liquid value behind false debts and forged losses. What remained was a shell, and the French were now inside it, marveling at the empty walls. Still, he gave them what they wanted: names of warehouses, lists of Ottoman creditors, keys to safe houses already emptied. In exchange, he watched every officer who asked too many questions, every soldier too curious about old alliances, every Frenchman who lingered over the wrong document. And above all, he watched for one name: Claude Derville. Then, on a day as dry as bone, it came. A letter arrived under Bermont's seal. Short, formal. Monsieur Derville arrives from Marseille to oversee financial compliance and political integration. Your assistance will be requested. It was signed not by Bermont but by an aide, which meant the general wanted distance. Claude was not just a bureaucrat. He was something else, something politically volatile. Yacob read the note twice, then burned it over a lantern. 2 nights later, Claude arrived. He was older than Yacob remembered, his face drawn but still handsome in that careful, polished way that men of politics cultivated. He wore a coat too new for the heat of Algeria and shoes too clean for the streets of Algiers. They met in the courtyard, under the shade of orange trees that still dripped with late summer fruit. Yacob Elbaz, Claude said, smiling with neither warmth nor malice. I wondered if you had survived. I did, Yacob said. As did you. Claude nodded, letting the moment settle between them. The past was not mentioned. Not yet. I have orders to recover Ottoman financial instruments, Claude said, pacing slowly. But the truth is, Paris wants something more, symbolic. Something to show that the old regime has been swept clean. That France has inherited legitimacy here. And you think that can be found in ledgers? In ledgers, Claude said, and in loyalty. Yacob did not reply. That night, he sat alone in the upper chamber of his home, staring out over the darkened city. Below, the streets were quiet, suffocated by curfews and uncertainty. The mosque minarets no longer echoed with the same clarity. And in the old Jewish quarter, doors were double-bolted not against thieves, but against neighbors who no longer smiled. Power had changed hands, but fear had merely changed uniforms. The map in Yacob's study, an old Ottoman chart inked on goatskin, still showed Algiers as a sunburst of trade. Arrows pointed to Malta, Tunis, Smyrna. But now, every route was shadowed by tricolor flags. The chest he had given Ismail contained only one copy of the letter. But the original was here, still sealed. He retrieved it from the hidden drawer behind his writing desk and weighed it in his hand. If he gave it to the right man in Paris, Claude would fall. Perhaps others with him. It would be enough to fracture the illusion of French moral authority in Algiers. But exposure would also risk retaliation. Not just against Yacob, but against his people. The Jews of Algiers had survived under the Ottomans by walking a tightrope of loyalty. Under French rule, they would walk a thinner one. No decision was without cost. No move without consequence. And so, Yacob wrote a letter, not to Paris, but to Cairo. In a cipher known only to 2 men, himself and a scholar he had once saved from execution in Alexandria. The letter was short, precise, and clear. The lion and the scorpion have met again. The vault remains intact. If the terms are still acceptable, send the olive ship. He sealed it, and gave it to a Berber courier who asked no questions. It was not war Yacob was preparing for. It was leverage. By the end of the month, Algiers had shed its Ottoman skin. French tricolors hung from mosques, consulates, and fortresses alike. Streets were renamed, markets restructured. The language of money had not changed, but its grammar had. All business was now French. All debts, by French decree, now belonged to the crown. And yet, among the colonels and bureaucrats, rumors still stirred. Gold shipments once promised had not materialized. Trade routes collapsed inexplicably, and from the ruins of the Ottoman bureaucracy, no complete financial trail could be found. As if, on the eve of collapse, the city's memory had been erased. Only one man, they said, could explain it. Yacob met with Claude Derville once more, this time inside the former Ottoman treasury, now a French customs office, patrolled by soldiers who didn't understand half the documents they carried. Claude dismissed the guards. The general wants a full report by week's end, he said. I have already begun it, Yacob replied. But some records may take longer to reconcile. Ottoman finances are opaque by design. Claude gave a humorless laugh. You always had a talent for complication. And you for simplification, Yacob said, letting the old tension curl between them. Claude walked slowly, running his fingers along the marble desk. You know, he said, there's a school of thought in Paris that believes men like you are no longer necessary. That colonized lands can be run like farms. Direct, mechanical. And what do you believe? Claude turned. I believe memory is dangerous. Especially when it belongs to the wrong people. Yacob held his gaze. Then perhaps Paris should be more careful who it forgets. Claude studied him for a moment longer, then walked out without another word. That night, the olive ship arrived. She slipped into the harbor under cover of mist, no flag, no name, no signal. A 3-mast brigantine with a hull stained dark by salt and age. Only those who knew what to look for would have seen her. And only one man in Algiers had been waiting for her. Yacob met her captain in the catacombs beneath the old synagogue, where walls had once echoed with prayers during the Inquisition. Now they echoed with quiet transactions. The captain, a Copt from Alexandria, gave a slow nod as he handed over the reply. The letter was brief. Your memory remains intact. Our offer stands. The vault, if needed, will be protected. Use the names we discussed. Let the lion watch the lion. It was signed not with a name, but with a sigil, a crescent hidden inside a six-pointed star. Yacob exhaled slowly. Cairo had confirmed. If the French turned against him, he would have protection. From Cairo, from Istanbul, even from distant merchant houses in Livorno and Salonika. Not military protection, financial, enough to turn banks against the occupation. Enough to bleed credibility from any official who tried to move against him. Now he had options. But with options came risk. And that risk had a name, Claude Derville. Later that week, Yacob met him one final time, in the upper gallery of a coffeehouse rebuilt by the French. They drank in silence at first, thick black brew in delicate white porcelain. Claude finally spoke. I received a letter from Marseille, he said. Yacob said nothing. It seems someone found an old copy of a financial transaction. One implicating me in unsanctioned trade. Corsair gold, Ottoman bribes. Still, Yacob said nothing. Claude leaned forward. What do you want? I want you to leave, Yacob said. Quietly. No scandal, no reports. Just vanish. And if I refuse? Yacob tilted his head. Then by this time next week, every major paper in Paris will carry your name. Not just yours. Others, too. Names the crown cannot afford to expose. Claude's eyes narrowed. You're bluffing. Am I? Claude studied him long enough to know the answer. 2 days later, Claude Derville was recalled to Paris under medical leave. No announcement, no inquiry, no replacement was sent. General Bermont never mentioned him again. Yacob watched the tricolor flags flutter over Algiers, knowing that empires moved slowly, but not blindly. He had bought time, but time would not hold forever. One day, they would realize what he had truly done. Until then, the ledgers remained hidden, the vault sealed, and the lion watched the lion. By the spring of 1831, the French occupation was no longer a military campaign, it was a bureaucracy. Scribes replaced soldiers, surveyors replaced scouts, and the true conquest, as Yacob had predicted, unfolded in ink, not blood. The city transformed in layers. Ottoman palaces became government offices. Corsair barracks became garrisons. Even the rhythm of life shifted. Prayers shortened, contracts lengthened, names slowly erased from record books unless they could be translated into French. Yacob remained untouched. Officially, he was now financial consultant to the Colonial Office. Unofficially, he was still the man whose silence had a price no one could afford. He moved carefully, slowly, but always forward. With the Ottoman debts now inherited by the French, he used their need for clarity to insert confusion. Every ledger's error, every inconsistency in a cargo manifest became a negotiation. A delay, a new favor owed. He quietly reacquired old Ottoman properties through intermediaries, warehouses near the port, vineyards in the hills, and a particularly strategic house once owned by a Corsair admiral whose descendants had vanished into Ottoman exile. He never took titles. He took control. But power has a shape, and shapes cast shadows. One evening, as the sun bled orange over the city, Yacob returned home to find an envelope placed carefully on his writing desk. Unmarked. Inside was a single page, unsigned. There are others who remember. Not just in Paris, not just in Cairo, you are not the only lion. He read it 3 times. Each time, slower than the last. The implication was clear. Someone had traced the Cairo correspondence. Someone had recognized the cipher. Someone with access, perhaps in the Colonial Office, or the merchant banks, or even among the former Ottoman scribes who now worked for the French. The illusion of security had always been temporary. But this letter confirmed it. He knew better than to react outwardly. Instead, he wrote a series of short messages, each in a different hand, each routed through a different port. One to Smyrna, another to Livorno, one to a Swiss banking house with no listed address. Each bore a variation of the same phrase, Stage 2 confirmed. Vault to be evaluated, eyes on Marseille. He gave the letters to separate couriers. None were to know of the others. One was a mute spice trader. One a child. One a blind woman who sold prayer beads. He trusted each more than he trusted any ally in uniform. The next day, he resumed his routine: meetings, consultations, polite disputes over estate inheritances. On the surface, nothing had changed. But beneath it, a second web began to spin. Then, days later, the second sign came. A coded message arrived through a merchant invoice from Oran. It mentioned unexpected fluctuations in cinnamon pricing. The phrase was innocuous, but the cipher was unmistakable. It meant someone in Paris had moved money, illegally, and in large amounts, into Algerian accounts. And not just any accounts. His accounts. A trap. Someone was trying to link him to illicit financial flows that hadn't originated with him. If successful, it could give the colonial office reason to revoke his immunity, or worse, place him under investigation by the French courts. He had been careful, but not invisible. Now he had a choice. He could cut ties, disappear, vanish into one of the escape routes he had long prepared. Or he could do what he had always done. Make the first move. That night, he summoned only 2 men, both older than himself, both of whom owed him debts from darker times. He showed them the letter, the invoice, the code. Then he gave them a task. Find out who sent this, he said, and make sure they regret it. He didn't ask for violence. He never had to. His weapons were older than knives. By the end of the month, a quiet scandal rippled through the colonial finance ministry. An official was removed, pending inquiry. No charges, no details. His name was not spoken again. But Yacob knew. It wasn't the official who'd authored the plot. He had been only the tip of the spear. The real threat still hid in the shadows. And for the first time in decades, Yacob felt the weight of age, not in body, but in mind. The city had changed, but not enough. Because somewhere, someone else remembered. And soon, he would have to choose not between enemies, but between heirs. Spring turned to the first burn of summer, and Algiers settled into a new equilibrium, half acceptance, half illusion. French officers dined in former Ottoman halls. Jewish merchants, cautious but adaptive, resumed trade under colonial oversight. The city moved forward, even as it forgot where it came from. Yacob Elbaz, however, did not forget. He had begun to see the limits of his design, not because it failed, but because it succeeded too well. He had become what the French called indispensable. A man whose knowledge had no equal, whose discretion had no flaw. But indispensability is a double-edged title. It makes men useful, until they become threatening. He knew he could not hold his position forever. Not in this climate. Not with whispers still circling about unaccounted Ottoman silver, or missing imperial taxes. Not when someone had tried to implicate him with the cinnamon cipher. The lion could only watch for so long. It was time to name a successor. But trust was scarce. He had no sons. His daughters had married into respected Jewish families, none of whom would touch the coils of Ottoman French finance. His cousins in Tunis had no appetite for subtlety. His protégés were either too young or too eager. All except one. Layla. She was the daughter of his younger brother, born during the famine year, raised between ledgers and salt cargo, trained not in theory but in silence. Unmarried, but not for lack of offers. She had refused them all. She knew maps better than any sailor. Understood trade routes like they were blood vessels. And more importantly, she knew when not to speak. He called for her late one evening, in the upper library where the walls were lined not with books, but with memory, contracts, notes, hidden pockets of parchment so old the ink had faded to rust. She came without a word, her eyes already questioning. I won't live long enough to protect what's coming, Yacob said, not as a lament, but as a ledger entry. She didn't argue, she only waited. I need someone who remembers, he continued. Not just the debts, the alignments, the mistakes, the costs. Layla finally spoke. You never wrote them down. No, he said, but I wrote the keys. In pieces, scattered across the vaults. You'll need Cairo, Livorno, Salonika, and you'll need allies who don't carry flags. He handed her a worn scroll, a genealogy, but not of family. Of transactions, alliances, names crossed in code, some dead, some alive, some erased. She took it like a blade, not a gift. You will never be recognized, Yacob said. They'll call you a clerk, a translator, at best, a functionary. But I will know, she said. That was all that mattered. He gave her 2 names, one in Marseille, one in Alexandria, and a third she already knew, the scholar in Cairo who signed with the crescent inside the star. These 3 will test you. They'll lie, delay, try to shift the balance. Let them, but hold the center. She nodded, and for the first time, he saw not his niece, but his replacement. Days later, as the call to prayer echoed faintly from the Kasbah, Yacob met once more with the colonial auditors. They presented him with new regulations, stricter controls over former Ottoman accounts, mandatory declarations of all non-French commercial assets. It was a slow noose. He listened, smiled, agreed to assist. But that night, he transferred 3 critical ledgers to Layla's possession. The originals, not the copies given to the French. She was to memorize them, then destroy them. The real records would live only in memory. A week later, he feigned illness. The colonial officials offered concern, then quickly forgot him. Within a month, he was declared inactive. And within 2 more, he was gone. No announcement, no burial procession, no obituary. Only a note found in his writing desk, addressed to no one. History does not belong to victors. It belongs to those who remember when to disappear. Layla Elbaz stood alone on the rooftop of her uncle's former home, now technically registered as a property of the French customs office, though no one dared enter it without her invitation. Below her, Algiers simmered under August heat, its white buildings glowing like bone, the harbor stirring with foreign ships and native suspicions. The old world had ended. But the new one was still uncertain. She had learned quickly. She wore anonymity like armor, presenting herself to the French administrators as a quiet financial aide, always one step behind the scenes, careful never to outshine, never to interrupt. But beneath her silence, she was already rebuilding the web Yacob had once ruled alone. She reopened contacts with Alexandria, sent coded invoices to Livorno and Smyrna, reconnected with a banker in Lisbon whose father had once worked with her grandfather during the Spanish exile. Each letter sent, each response received, confirmed the same truth: the memory had survived. In private, she decoded her uncle's final scrolls, cross-referencing names, tracing transactions, uncovering old debts still unpaid. Some involved long-dead pashas. Others were more dangerous. French names, still active, still powerful. Men whose hands had quietly profited from Ottoman decay. She catalogued each one, but took no action. Not yet. Instead, she focused on reinforcing the vault, digitally invisible, but structurally impenetrable. Not of stone or steel, but of mutual debt, shared risk, and old alliances hidden in plain sight. She took meetings in the souk with spice merchants whose caravans reached as far as Fez. She negotiated protection contracts with Corsican shipping captains who flew no flag. And once, in the back room of a mosque now serving as a school, she brokered a deal between 3 rival Jewish families who had refused to speak since the day's surrender. They spoke to her. Because she didn't ask them to trust her. She only asked them to remember. But even memory has enemies. One afternoon, a French officer, a young one, new to Algiers, requested a meeting. He brought an inquiry from Paris. A vague one, but with sharp teeth. They had reopened the investigation into Claude Derval's activities. A new government faction had come into power, one eager to audit colonial irregularities. They wanted access to historical financial advisors. The officer was polite, but beneath his courtesy lay the same threat her uncle had once faced: exposure disguised as procedure. Layla listened, smiled, took the papers. Then she wrote 3 letters. The first went to Marseille, to the son of a wine merchant who owed her family 2 generations of silence. The second went to Cairo, to the scholar who still signed his letters with the crescent in the star. The third was left unsigned, but carried a single phrase, etched into wax: "The lioness is awake." Within 2 weeks, the inquiry was withdrawn. The officer reassigned. The silence resumed. But Layla did not celebrate. She only noted the shift. They were testing her, measuring, waiting to see if the new guardian of the vault was as dangerous as the last. She intended to be worse. In time, she began rewriting the map. Not physically, but structurally. The trade routes, the silver corridors, the interest chains. She altered weights, rerouted caravans through safer ports, embedded ghost accounts inside French financial systems using the very same code the Colonial Office had once designed to surveil North African trade. And over time, the weight of history shifted, again. No empire noticed. But the city did. They began to call her the Quiet Compass. Children spoke of her as a woman who could move gold without touching it, silence without speaking, memory without documents. She never denied it. And deep within the old vault beneath Hammam el-Kebir, where no Ottoman ever returned and no Frenchman dared descend, Layla placed a single item. A sealed letter written in her uncle's hand, never opened. She didn't read it. She didn't need to. She only added her own beside it, sealed in wax, marked with her sign, a lioness, watching over a vault. No date, no name, only a sentence. When memory is threatened, you do not run. You remember harder.